everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing Jeskai in Tarkir Dragonstorm. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Jeskai performs roughly average, and it's drafted roughly an average amount. It's kind of weird to look at win rates and draft frequencies by archetype in this format because of how it doesn't really break by normal color pairs, and it's very hard to compare what exactly is Jeskai versus two of the Jeskai colors with a splash. Are the archetypes listed by 17 lands as Boros with a splash? How many of those are Jeskai and how many of them are Mardu? And how do you compare 2-color versus 3-color win rates in general in a way that accounts for the thing where you're in to where if at the end of the draft you're 2-color, it's more likely that you were just in a more open lane. So win rates in general here are very confusing. Also, there are 4 and 5-color decks, and it's all kind of weird. But Jeskai is, I don't know, kind of normal in general. So I've so far discussed 2-color decks on the podcast about this set, which notably that's theoretically designed for 3-color decks. So this will be my first touching on actual 3-color decks with this set. I think that most of the 3-color decks can be approached in a few different ways because, as I've talked about before, the real synergies are mostly rooted in 2-color rather than in 3-color. So if you have a 2-color base, then which 2-color base you are is kind of a different deck. And in the 3-color group, you kind of need to navigate, am I doing one, both, or neither of these 2-color bases? And then there's also just all the normal, how aggressive am I? How controlling am I? How am I making my mana work? Am I making my mana work in a way that fits with being aggressive? And within that kind of wide range and a lot of space in how you navigate figuring out a 3-color deck, I kind of feel like Jeskai might have the widest range because on the one hand, you have the Boros aggro roots potentially splashing some blue cards that are technically Jeskai decks, but then you also have the hardcore inevitability spell-based decks that I think are best when they're drafted around opening a 7-mana mythic like Ugin or Jeskai Revelation or Inspired Ultimatum. And then you also have Jeskai Dragons, and then these slower Jeskai decks might not even strictly be Jeskai. They can pretty easily splash another color or two. There's a lot of different space in what can be a Jeskai deck. So I'm going to talk about different things that are going on here rather than discussing this as a single archetype. With Boros and with Green-Black, I was really looking at okay, this is a 2-color deck. You're trying to be aggressive. You're accepting that your opponent has more power than you. Here's how to do that. Here, often that won't be the case. Often you are trying to just have more power than whatever your opponent's doing. So I'm just going to talk about some of the stuff that can be going on with Jeskai, but all the different decks are going to be pretty different. Let's start with Flurry, the Jeskai mechanic. It's not a mechanic that gives a ton of direction to your draft. The +1/+1 counter stuff is kind of not exactly binary because it's okay, well, how many cards do you have that give a +1/+1 counters? That's a range. But with Flurry, it's well, any card technically can be part of casting 2 spells. So it's not a clear, okay, these cards contribute to this thing and these cards don't. And a lot of making Flurry work is it's as much in how you actually play your games and how you use your spells as it is in drafting cards that make it work. You can make choices to be better at triggering Flurry, but what it means is a lot murkier. And that also means that it's more just kind of fine or whatever to play like a small number of flurry cards, and you can play your game in a way where that might come up or not. Whereas, you can't really have just like one counters payoff and maybe like two cards that give counters. So if you are drafting around it, then it's worth noting that cheap spells and spells that draw cards are kind of the best way to support like making flurry happen. And in particular, I think that it's pretty easy to value Durgar Island Dragon, the blue common omen dragon that can be a one in a blue, tap a thing, draw a card, tap up to one thing, draw a card. And Storm Shriek Feral, the red tormenting voice omen dragon. And Unending Whisper, the harmonized draw a card for single blue that harmonizes for 5 and a blue. All of those cards are kind of like fine in most decks, but not super high priorities for most people. So you can like value those, and that's a bunch of extra like cheap cantrips that you can get at common. And so those would be like the cards that I would be looking to value a little bit more highly if I was specifically concerned with triggering Flurry. So if, for example, my draft started with like a Corey Steelcutter, then I would be very interested in trying to pick those cards up. Notably, 2 of those are dragons. So that means there's some overlap in trying to do Flurry and having dragons, which leads pretty naturally into drafting payoffs for dragons. The exhales are just very good and play pretty well with everything Jeskai is trying to do. They're like cheap cards that pair well with card draw, make the game go longer, totally reasonable to double spell with, minus the blue one, which isn't the best for double spelling, but whatever. And the Dragon Storms, the uncommon enchantments that return when you play a dragon. In particular, Roiling Dragonstorm, the blue one, is basically a cheap cantrip that also returns to your hand so that you can cast it again. So it's fantastic for Flurry. The white one is very powerful, but not especially good for Flurry since it costs 4 mana. The red one is the weakest and most expensive, but incidentally awesome at flurrying since it basically guarantees that you flurry. So basically, like, there is reasonable overlap with I'm a flurry deck and a dragon deck, except there's some question here about, like, okay, well, what does it mean to be a flurry deck? Like, what cards with flurry are you actually playing? Are you excited about, like, a 2-mana 2/1 haste that does a damage to your opponent when you flurry in your dragon deck? I certainly wouldn't expect that you are. Are you excited about a 3-mana 2/3 that grows and scries when you flurry? Well, the win rate says you're not. It's not a card that performs especially well, but I kind of think that it might be a fine card to include in, like, if you have a bunch of those dragons and you're pretty good at flurrying, the scry one is very nice. There are very few cards that actually have flurry that really make sense in the decks that are good at triggering flurry. I guess like Jeskai Disciple is pretty nice. Like, you want to smooth out your mana in Jeskai, and it's fine to attack for 3. So anyway, for the most part, I don't think flurry is a big deal. That said, I do think that like the 5-mana flurry type cards, or cards that are kind of intended to work in that space, Narset's Rebuke, the deal 5, get 3 mana, and Focus on the Mind. Draw 3, discard 1 for 5 that costs 2 less if it's your second spell. I think those are both good and good together. And I think that they're actually kind of weaker the more you're like a dragon deck, because when you're a dragon deck, you want your like top end to be dragons. I think one of the main things to be thinking about in Jeskai is like what the top of your curve looks like. because there are a lot of expensive commons that you want to play. And while I think you can play more of them than usual, because like Narset's Rebuke and Focus on the Mind don't exactly need 5 mana, or don't exactly tie up 5 mana. You have both of those and Ice Ridge Serpent, the 5 mana 3/3 that bounces something, and then whatever dragons you're interested in. And it ends up just being a lot of expensive cards. So you need to figure out, like, okay, how many expensive cards am I playing? What are they? And again, like, given that the dragons have omens, so they don't have to be expensive spells, you can have curves that, like, look pretty heinous, and it can be functional, but you still want to, like, try to, exercise some restraint or figure out some kind of plan about what your expensive cards are going to be. Commons you're looking for outside of like the stuff that enables Flurry, I think you generally by default want, removal and like the 2-for-1 creatures like Sibsig and Pack Beast, Sibsig Appraiser and Salt Road Pack Beast. And then like the more you have Salt Road Pack Beast, the more you're interested in stuff like Fortress Kinguard that makes it easier to cast. Humbling Elder, the blue 1/2 flash that gives something -2 power when it enters. This is a card that actually has like kind of a strong pedigree. Like there have been cards like this in other formats that are generally largely dismissed and then quietly have good stats. And in general, I think Humbling Elder doesn't have like great stats here, but that Jeskai is very much the right place for it. You're not so aggressive that it bothers you to have a creature with only 1 power or like a 1-drop that you don't necessarily want to deploy on turn 1. It's a cheap spell to like double spell with if you're doing any of the Flurry stuff. And it's tempo positive. Like it will often result in trading up on mana in some way at some point in the game. And I think that like that's something that you're very interested in. I think that you have card draw, which means that you're interested in like mana positive exchanges because you're going to like make up for any card disadvantage going on there. And you're very meaningfully playing to the battlefield, so you are going to have creatures to work with, but you're like not exclusively like blocking or attacking. Like you're usually going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's going to maximize the number of like combats that are happening where there could be like productive uses for Humbling Elder. And I just think that like, the tempo positive stuff, like anything that trades up for mana, bounce and stuff like that, is going to generally work well into the space where you're like not as aggro as you could be, but like not, pure like board control or whatever. And I think Humbling Elder's just like a nice, flexible piece that interacts well with like the range of game textures that you're going to find yourself in, and then also supports Salt Road Pack Beast and any of the Flurry stuff or cast your second spell stuff pretty cheaply. So I think like the dragons type decks are, and like when you have all these like, random like positive value creatures that like aren't very big, but like, can pair with each other or some removal or some tricks and like, make some combat happen, let you like, push some damage while you're like ahead on cards and you've killed your opponent's creatures so that you're kind of just like ending the game with your like random value 2/1s and stuff. You're going to be in kind of the like mid-range, like, I don't know, like slop type space where you're just kind of, in a mid-range battle against like the multicolored decks and the dragons decks and stuff. And there are a lot of really powerful, expensive cards in this format. So just like I had some creatures that drew some cards, so now I'm like up some material is very far from game winning. Like it's going to take a lot more than that to have won a game in this limited format. You need something that's, like overwhelmingly powerful top end, like the mythics that I discussed earlier, or you need, like to attack your opponent for like a lot of damage. Like there's so much incidental life gain, you kind of need to like be able to deal 30 or whatever. And I guess where I'm going with this is that I think like a lot of the Jeskai decks are gonna just kind of be in the like mid-range space where you kind of don't know like who has inevitability or like whether you're gonna win long games, and the like role assessment is generally going to be challenging long term, such that your role assessment is more something that you figure out tactically than strategically, which is to say, make good attacks where you can, like pressure your opponent when you're ahead, but understand that like your conception of your role in the match should be fairly dynamic. Like you're going to need to update it every turn based on like what's actually in play. What does your hand look like? How many cards does your opponent have? What kind of cards do you think that they have? Which is not my preferred space to operate in. I generally like to, know, draft a deck where I know the role going in. And so I try to lean toward like drafting the more aggressive Jeskai decks unless I have some of the overwhelming late game, and then like really lean into that by maximizing removal and card draw and planning to find those cards. But I know that, there's no reason that Jeskai can't kind of get more into the like mid-range space. And I think a lot of the, like Jeskai trophy decks that I've got are like a little bit less focused and more just like, yeah, I have some like two drops that like happen to be able to beat them up, but I also have like some, late game powerful spells, and maybe my two drops will put them on the back foot and then maybe not be the perfect blocker, but maybe the fact that my opponent has to kind of respect counterattacks means that they'll like end up functioning like decently enough at getting me to the late game where my late game isn't as like overwhelming as it could be, but it's like good enough that, if my opponent doesn't draw their bomb and I draw my powerful cards, then, I could beat whoever. So I don't know what single point I'm making. I'm just kind of discussing the space because, again, I do think that it's just like a pretty open ended and versatile space. So there's a lot to like consider here. Another thing that I looked at is like, at least for me, there are a lot of uncommons that look kind of like they're designed for Jeskai. And it's like, okay, but like Flurry is so weird to evaluate because it's such like a small thing. Like, this isn't like, does the Flurry deck work? It's more like, is there a Flurry deck? When should I use the cards that look like they might go in a Flurry deck? So there are like uncommons that, kind of exist in that space, like have Flurry or look like they're designed to support Flurry, where it's like, okay, I don't know exactly how good these are, exactly when they're going to be good. So I looked at the uncommons that don't perform especially well in Jeskai according to 17 lands, and just paid attention to like which of them are like sometimes good but don't perform well in Jeskai, or I personally have found difficult to like evaluate, or like not been sure if a particular deck wants it or not. So this is a list of cards that generally have pretty bad stats, but that I think are interesting enough that they read like you might sometimes want to play them, where my conclusion isn't this card is bad, you shouldn't play it, but rather in the aggregate, this card doesn't perform well. So if you're going to play it, you should have some reason to believe that it's better than its like aggregate case in your deck. So that list includes Reverberating Summons. That's the one in a red enchantment that becomes a 3/3 haste creature when you play your second spell, and you can spend one in a red and sacrifice it to discard your hand and draw two. Doesn't perform well in aggregate. War Effort. That's the in a red enchantment that gives all your creatures +1/+0, and when you attack makes a 1/1. That card is very good in like the aggressive like Boros and Mardu decks. But that's because it plays really well with like other mobilize and plays well when you're like always aggressive. And Jeskai is on the controlling side of flexible, I would say, in aggregate. Like the dedicated aggressive commons and like the mobilized commons and stuff perform poorly here, and the like removal and card advantage commons perform well. So war effort in aggregate is out of place. Breaching Dragonstorm doesn't perform well. This one's confusing to try to evaluate from the stats because, like, I don't know how many dragons people have on average when, like, the aggregate data set. Like, what is the average number of dragons in a deck with Breaching Dragonstorm? I don't know. What's the curve like with Breaching Dragonstorm? Are people putting Breaching Dragonstorm in a deck with a bunch of 1s and 2s and counter spells and stuff that are like bad hits? Or are people only playing it in the decks where it's pretty good relative to its range? So I'm not sure if the card is like bad in general or not, but you should have like you should be very serious about your dragons if you're going to play it, I think. Fleeting Effigy, the red 2/2 haste that you can pump and returns to your hand at the end of your turn. This card is fantastic at enabling Flurry. Pretty good aggressive card. The like pumping ability like means that it can just like kind of deal a whole bunch of damage out of nowhere in the late game. But it has absolutely no defensive function whatsoever. Like you can never block with it. So you need to be careful about like only playing it in aggressive decks and or decks that have tons and tons of synergy with it. Again, this is one where I think the ceiling is actually pretty high, but in aggregate it doesn't perform well, so be careful with it. Overwhelming Surge, the kind of better Abrade if you ignore the fact that it costs an extra mana, so deal 3 damage and or destroy an artifact for 3. Doesn't perform well. It's very good when you get to do both things, but 3 mana to like kill a 3 toughness creature means that or a creature with 3 toughness or less means that it's pretty rare that you're trading up on mana. This is sometimes like really good against the like Dragonstorm, the like Globe decks, but again, not great in aggregate. Wayspeaker Bodyguard, this one's weird. So this is the 3 and a white 3/4 that returns a non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand when you play it, and taps something when you flurry. I'm confused by how bad the stats on this card is. Like, if you have something in your graveyard to get back, it's an immediate 2 for 1 with like a pretty reasonable body, and the flurry ability is pretty good. I think it's just that like actually having something to get back with this is like a bigger ask than you think. Like that just doesn't naturally happen all that reliably. And the tapping ability, again, like, it's generally tapping things on your turn. So it's generally like better if you're attacking than if you're blocking. And so it's generally like not so good in the more defensive Jeskai decks that seem to compose the majority of the data. Again, I still think Wayspeaker Bodyguard's like a pretty good card if you are good at having stuff in your graveyard for it, but don't just like always prioritize it or play it, and maybe take it a little later than you might if you like the card. Effortless Master, this is the blue-red gold card, the 4/3 that gets 2+1/+1 counters if it was the second spell that you cast with Vigilance and Menace. This card just reads terrible. I maybe shouldn't have included it here, except I really wanted to point out, like, hey, this card sucks, don't play it. Jeskai Brushmaster, I think, is like a little bit more complicated. Like, it's hard to cast and doesn't give you any immediate value, but Double Strike Flurry, can be a lot. But I think, a 4 mana card that at the end of the day is basically just power and toughness is not really where you want to be, especially when it's like hard to cast because you need all 3 colors. Defibrillating Current. This is the Mardu card that deals 4 and gains 2. This card, like, just feels like it should be an instant. Just like when I first saw it, I assumed it was an instant just by, like, I don't know, intuitive, like, power level for casting cost or whatever. And I thought it was really good. And then I played it and learned that it was a sorcery. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess, you're still, killing most things and gaining some life. Like, this might be fine. But it's been pretty underwhelming. I don't think it's a terrible card, but when it's always costing 4, I'm not happy about it. And Frontline Rush, the white red instant that makes 2 guys or gives a creature +X for X the number of creatures you control. Pretty good Boros aggro card, but doesn't perform well in the aggregate Sky deck. Again, the aggro cards don't perform well here. So those are the what I considered the notable uncommons. For further, information or evaluation on that stuff, check out just like 17 Lands Game and Hand Win Rate for uncommons in Jeskai. But I thought that those cards in particular were definitely ones where I have been unsure about them myself when drafting. And I think that covers like my thoughts on this space. I touched briefly on the idea that, I don't want to draft like a real control deck unless I have, one of the busted mythics. Elspeth, Meringue River Regent, that's a rare, but whatever. Jeskai Revelation, Ugin, Shiko, Inspired Ultimatum. Those cards are all like ridiculous. And, if you have any of those, then you can, lean a lot more into drafting control. Also, if you have any of those, Monastery Messenger gets like a lot better, which is important to pay attention to. This is the like hybrid Jeskai common 2/3 flying vigilance, because like that card's not very good in general. Like if it's just getting normal cards back, it's pretty whatever. But if you have, one of the really good things, then being able to get that really good thing back is really good. So, I think your like default messenger stock is pretty low, but pay attention to like it can go up quick if you have the right stuff to return. Also, Quarry Steelcutter and Sage of the Skies are like about as strong as the other rares that I listed, but with them the incentive isn't to draft like hard control deck. Their Quarry Steelcutter especially is better if you're aggressive. Sage of the Skies is like broken no matter what, but you don't need to draft a control deck to support it. So, yeah, I think that, those cards are all good reasons to get into drafting Jeskai for the people who are like, so when do you draft Jeskai? Well, if you open any of those, probably just take it and make it happen. And now I think that covers everything. So, first, I want to thank the newest patrons this week. So, Jeremy and John, thank you very much for the support. Really appreciate it. If anyone else is interested in considering joining the Drafting Archetypes Patreon, please take a minute and check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. And of course, if you are not interested in doing that, but you like what I'm doing here and want to support the podcast for free, consider leaving a review or just talking to your friends about it. All right. Now, for questions from chat. How does Osseous Exile fit into Jeskai? Or does it not? No, it does. This is the White Exile. The White Exile, because a lot of the time it's going to be like killing an attacker, it's not like the greatest at triggering Flurry, but again, Flurry is not really like that significant anyway. And since you have like a lot of expensive cards you want to play and a lot of kind of like natural card advantage, I think that like Jeskai is particularly interested in 1-for-1 removal. So like all the exhales you can get are generally going to be pretty good. I've been trying to build around multiple. I'm going to assume this is supposed to say Monastery Messengers because it has a powerful ETB and often tables. The idea is to play one of the powerful 2 mana spells like Rebuff, Glacial Dragon Hunt, Molten Exhale on 2, and get it back to double spell on 4. As you mentioned, it's best at getting back more powerful spells. In your experience, do you think it's worthwhile to do so, or is it too underpowered? I think just like getting back a 2 mana spell, especially a 2 mana spell that has Harmonize, so you're like losing the Harmonize value from your first cast so that you can like double spell with a 2 mana spell and another 2 mana spell on 4 is like not a great idea. Also, like your odds of wanting to like profitably cast like a bounce spell on 2 so that you can like draw that like the idea that you're curving rebuff into messenger into rebuff is insane. Like the possibility that your opponent plays a 2 drop that you're excited to bounce with your rebuff, to say nothing of the fact that you might be on the play and then you'd need to bounce their 1 drop. And then the idea that you'd want to draw it again after you've sorcery speed bounced a cheap creature, like that shouldn't be part of this equation. Glacial Dragon Hunt, similar situation. Like the problem is that like this curve that you're talking about relies on I'm gonna want to kill my opponent's creature on turn 2 instead of playing this 2 drop that I implicitly have because I'm trying to double spell on 4. So presumably I just have another 2 mana spell in my hand. Like the curve being described here just makes no sense. So I think that you should expect that if you're playing it on turn 3, that you're not going to be getting a spell back. And then, like, well, maybe later in the game I play it and I get back a Molten Exhale. Like, yeah, that's kind of the default case. That's fine. Like, the Molten Exhale is probably going to be an above average draw. But, like, I think a specific weakness is that a lot of the things that you might want to get back, like, have Harmonize. And so when you get them back, you're like losing a cast from your graveyard to get a cast from your library, so you're kind of only drawing half of the card. Um and that's like some, I don't know, pretty obvious synergy. So I guess I would say nothing about this idea convinces me that it's not the case that like I think that this is kind of the exact thing that I'm describing when I say messenger, with commons or whatever is not good. And you want to like you should only really be like thinking about trying to pick it up if you have like rares that are good to get back. Is Teamer Tony back as a 4 drop playable or avoid at all costs? I don't know about avoid at all costs. It's not something I'm looking to put in my deck. Like, I don't think that it's like an above rate 4 drop. Like, I think I would probably rather just have like the 3/3 that makes a treasure with prowess, like the 3/3 prowess that makes a treasure, which I think you're generally not looking to play and can kind of pick up whenever. If you like have some tawny backs because you were thinking about like playing Teamer and you ended up like not doing it and you don't have like better cards, like it is what it is. If you can get a couple of green sources and you're like playing it and it costs like 3.5 mana, like that's fine. But I don't think that it's something that you should be like looking to spend 4 for. Can Ringing Strike Mastery have a home in Jeskai, or is the archetype generally not aggressive enough to make the card playable? I think it's most reasonable as a sideboard card in best of 3 against like, you know, big stuff or clunky decks. Or like I had like a red white aggro deck at the Spotlight series that I played against a Teval, and I thought about like splashing blue to side in Ringing Strike Mastery. I didn't end up doing it, but that was a space where like if I was already Jeskai, I probably would have boarded it in because I like didn't have any removal and the Teval was going to be kind of a problem, but like locking it down is kind of awesome. But in general, like the card is just like pretty bad. So, maybe if you're like happen to be a very aggressive, like, blue-red splash white deck, like, you might be able to justify playing one, but might be better to just, like, not do that. In general, I just, like, don't really like to think of Ringing Strike Mastery as a playable card, and, see exceptions where they come up rather than, like, looking for opportunities to try it. If you ended up with 4 or more copies of the blue cantrip common with Harmonize, would you start cutting lands? This is one of those I would build my deck type questions. Like, it just depends on, like, the rest of the curve and my mana requirements and, like, what my lands are and how good I am at, like, casting it on turn 1 and, like, how often I am to cast it early and, like, how important it is. Like, am I planning to, like, reliably cast it on turn 1 or 2 such that it's helping me hit my 3rd land drop? How important is it to hit my 3rd land drop on 3? But, like, yes, if you have a lot of cheap cantrips, you should evaluate your land count. How good is New Way Forward? Is it just okay? Is it a bomb? Should we take this over other card draw effects? So this is a pretty weird rare that I'm not going to try to rely on my own experience, which has been pretty minimal with. I'm going to check the data and discuss. So New Way Forward has a 54.7% game in hand win rate on 17 lands, which is pretty low. Notably, it does have, like, an improvement when drawn of, like, 4.4%, which is a little bit surprising. I think that in general, it's, like, not very good / a sideboard card, but I think it's, like, okay to play it. I don't think that you should prioritize it. It's drafted pretty early. I think that, the smart play is just, like, you shouldn't be drafting it high enough to ever have it. But it's not, if I think basically, like, if you have it, it's often, not going to be your worst card. You should probably play it and don't expect a ton out of it. You shouldn't be drafting it, like, in the first few picks, so you just shouldn't end up with it at most tables. You talked about Humbling Elder being good for triggering Flurry. How often do you cast it without getting value in combat? Pretty rarely, but, like, I think that it would be very realistic to, like, on turn 4, I don't have another thing to do, so I, like, pass the turn, combat doesn't happen, I just, like, flash that in and then use the discount to cast Focus on the Mind. Like, that's a very reasonable, like, play pattern that could come up where you, like, aren't getting value in combat for it. But usually I'm just, like, treating it as a combat trick that gives some, like, leftover value, unless, there's just, like, something else that's, like, making it worth, like, casting and not having access to that combat trick anymore. How do you think about splashing a 4th color? Any preference between black or green splash? Does splashing change the value, how you value the Flurry package or Dragons package? Splashing is generally friends with dragons because you have access to more gold dragons. Like, those are likely to be a thing that you're splashing. Also, like, you might play the globe, and the globe is, like, good for splashing and good with dragons. Splashing is slightly bad with Flurry because you have more tap lands, so, like, cantrips are worse and you just have a little bit less mana to work with over the course of the game. And you're a little bit more likely to have more expensive spells because you're more likely to splash expensive spells than cheap spells. Are you more likely to splash, like, green or black? I think that is basically a function of your base colors, but I'd say pretty flexible there. How do you think about it? The more controlling I am, the more into splashing a 4th color I am. The more ridiculous a bomb that requires a 4th color, the more inclined to take it I am. Early in the draft, I'm, like, pretty open to looking for lands that make it easier to splash additional colors to just see if something comes together. Off-color devotees are pretty reasonable, like, Mardu Devotee or whatever. Mardu Devotee in particular is, like, a pretty reasonable card to play in Jeskai that then makes black splashes quite a bit easier. I think those are the thoughts that I have on how I think about splashing. Can you say more about the relationship between base color and splash color? Yes. If you are base red-white, you're probably a lot more likely to splash black than green because any green gold card would be relatively difficult for you to cast. If you are base red blue, you are also, or you're more likely to splash green than black for, revert the same reasoning applied the other way. If you're base blue white, which is rare, then you're not very likely to splash in general, but you're a little bit more kind of open to whatever if there's a really good reason. Okay, I think that's going to wrap up Dragonstorm Jeskai. I feel like this was, I don't know, a little disjointed or lacking focus, where I feel like sometimes I have like a thesis about like, okay, here's what this archetype is, or here's how you should draft this, or what this should look like. And this isn't that. This isn't to say like I feel like I've done something wrong, just I think that that's what this space is, but it feels a little off. But that's fine. I can sit with that. So anyway, I will be back next week for another Tarkir Dragonstorm archetype as expected. So thanks for listening. Thank you, especially those watching live, especially those who had questions. Have a good week. I'll see you next week. And bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.